broken-down car and a simple act of kindness spark an unexpected connection between two strangers from entirely different worlds. But what unfolds next will challenge everything they thought they knew about society, about acceptance, and about themselves. What would you do if a single moment had the power to change your entire perspective? Let us know in the comments section below. The old Cadillac sat on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly as if calling out for help. Richard Lawson sighed, stepping out onto the sun-scorched pavement, his stiff joints aching with the weight of his 78 years. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, distorting the world around him. He hadn't changed a tire in decades, and at his age, he wasn't about to start now. Traffic roared past, indifferent. A few cars slowed, their drivers peering out of their windows, but none stopped. Just another old man in a broken-down car. Not their problem. Then, as if appearing from nowhere, a voice cut through the noise. "Need a hand with that?" Richard turned, squinting. A teenage girl stood on the sidewalk, one hand resting on the strap of her backpack. She had a sharp jawline, bright green eyes, and messy blonde hair tucked under a worn-out baseball cap. She was small, wiry, but something about her posture, casual, confident, told him she was used to hard work. He almost dismissed her. Too young, too thin, what could she possibly do? But before he could respond, she was already setting her backpack down, stepping closer. "I'm Hannah," she said, crouching beside the flat tire. "I've changed a few of these before. It's not that bad once you get the hang of it." Richard hesitated, watching her. There was something about her voice, light but steady, carrying a quiet strength. It took him a moment to notice the small silver pin on her backpack, a pastel-colored flag with pink, blue, and white stripes. He didn't know much about those kinds of things, but he knew enough. Transgender. He blinked, shifting uncomfortably, not because he had anything against her, at least he didn't think so, but because he didn't know what to say. What was the polite thing to do? Should he acknowledge it, ignore it? Before he could figure it out, she was already working, hands moving with practiced ease. "Got a jack?" she asked. Richard cleared his throat. "In the trunk." She nodded, standing up to grab it. He watched her move, noting the slight tension in her shoulders. She was used to people staring, used to people hesitating around her. "You do this a lot?" he asked. She shrugged, pulling the jack from the trunk. "Enough. My uncle's a mechanic. Used to let me help out in the shop before, people started talking." She smirked, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Turns out not everyone likes the idea of a trans girl fixing their cars. Richard felt a twinge of something he couldn't quite place. Pity? Guilt? He wasn't sure. Yeah, she exhaled sharply, positioning the jack under the car. People can be weird about things that don't affect them at all. She lifted the car with slow, deliberate movements, sweat forming at her temples. Richard felt useless standing there, but he didn't want to get in her way. "I was always taught to mind my own business," he said finally. "Wish more people were like that," Hannah muttered, loosening the lug nuts. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the occasional screech of metal. Richard found himself studying her again. She looked like any other teenager, except for the way she carried herself, like she had already lived through more than she should have. "You in school?" "Was," she said simply. "Dropped out a few months back. Things got complicated." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Just got tired of fighting for a space that didn't want me there. Teachers didn't know what to do with me, students sure as hell didn't. So I figured, why waste the energy?" Richard wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't his world, but he knew something about being unwanted, about feeling like you didn't belong. "Parents okay with that?" Hannah snorted, pulling the spare tire from the trunk. "Yeah, if I had any. Grew up in the system. A few decent foster homes, a few bad ones. Mostly I just learned to look out for myself." Richard felt another pang of discomfort. A kid with no real home. A kid who had to fight just to be herself. She finished tightening the lug nuts, wiped the back of her hand against her forehead, and stood up. There. Should hold up fine till you get it checked out properly. Richard glanced at the newly changed tire, then back at her. He felt an odd sort of gratitude, not just for the help, but for the unexpected conversation, for the way she had spoken so openly, without hesitation, about something he knew people treated as taboo. He reached for his wallet. "Let me give you something for your trouble." Hannah's eyes flickered down to the money he held out, then back up to his face. She let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "No, I didn't do it for that." Richard frowned. "Then why?" She slung her backpack over her shoulder, stepping away. "Because I know what it's like when no one stops to help." With that, she turned and started walking down the street, disappearing into the crowd. Richard stood there for a long time, staring after her. The city moved around him, oblivious. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had witnessed something important, something that mattered. Richard couldn't shake the image of the girl, Hannah, she'd said, walking away. There was something about her that lingered in his mind, more than just the unexpected kindness. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like she'd long since accepted that the world wouldn't make room for her. Or maybe it was that last sentence she'd said, "Because I know what it's like when no one stops to help." Richard had spent most of his life as the one people stopped for, the one they offered assistance to out of deference or obligation. His wealth, his reputation, doors had always opened for him. Yet here was this teenager, a girl who barely had anything to her name, who had no one looking out for her, and she'd still taken the time to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. He found himself driving through the city later that evening, eyes scanning the sidewalks as he navigated through the familiar streets. He had no real reason to look for her. She had fixed his tire, she was gone, and that should have been the end of it. But there was a restlessness in him, an itch in his chest that he couldn't quite ignore. When the red light caught him at a busy intersection, he saw her. Hannah was sitting on the curb outside a convenience store, a plastic bag beside her, tearing pieces off a gas station sandwich and eating them absently. A group of teenagers walked past, 2 boys and a girl, their voices sharp with laughter. One of them, a tall boy in a hoodie, slowed just long enough to mutter something as he passed her. Hannah didn't react, didn't even look up, but Richard saw the way her shoulders tensed, how her fingers tightened around the sandwich wrapper. The boy smirked as he walked away. Richard clenched his jaw. He had no idea what the kid had said, but he had a pretty good guess. The light turned green, but Richard pulled into the nearest parking space instead. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, why he felt the sudden need to approach her. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in strangers' problems. He had spent his life as an observer, detached, watching from a comfortable distance. But something about Hannah made the distance feel wrong. She noticed him as he stepped onto the sidewalk, her eyes flickering up from the sandwich. "You again?" she said, chewing slowly. Richard hesitated. He had no idea what to say now that he was standing here. "You okay?" It was a dumb question, and he realized it the second it left his mouth. Hannah smirked around a bite of food. "Yeah, just living the dream." He glanced down at the bag beside her. There wasn't much inside. Another sandwich, a bottle of water, and what looked like a pack of crackers. Barely a meal. "You live around here?" Her smirk faded slightly. "I crash where I can." Richard frowned. "You don't have a place to stay?" She let out a short laugh. "What gave it away? The fine dining experience?" She held up the sandwich for emphasis before shrugging. "Yeah, no permanent address. Not really a huge market for renting to trans kids with no job history or parental co-signers." There it was again, the unspoken truth about her life, slipped into the conversation like a casual afterthought. But Richard could hear what she wasn't saying. "You got anyone looking out for you?" She snorted. "Yeah, me." He exhaled sharply, glancing down the street where the group of teenagers had disappeared. "Those kids bothering you?" Hannah rolled her eyes. "Nah, just the usual. People see a trans girl alone, they think they've got something to say. Not the first time. Won't be the last." Her voice was calm, as if she had made peace with this kind of treatment a long time ago, but Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He had always been aware, in an abstract way, that the world was cruel to people who didn't fit into the narrow expectations of society. But standing here, looking at her, hearing the resignation in her voice, it made it real in a way he hadn't experienced before. "You should eat something better than that junk," he said finally, nodding at the sandwich. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "You offering?" He considered it. He didn't know what he was doing or why, but the thought of walking away now, of leaving her here alone to fend for herself, made him feel strangely unsettled. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the diner across the street. "My treat." Hannah studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether this was some kind of trick. Then, with a small shrug, she grabbed her bag and stood. Inside the diner, they took a booth near the window. The place was nearly empty, just a few late-night customers hunched over coffee and plates of half-eaten food. Hannah slid into the seat across from him, stretching her arms over her head. "So," she said, "what's the deal here? Rich, old guy suddenly decides to play Good Samaritan?" Richard smirked. "Something like that." The waitress came by, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and Richard gestured for Hannah to order first. She skimmed the menu quickly before shutting it with a decisive snap. "Burger. Fries. Chocolate shake." Richard lifted an eyebrow. "You don't waste time." Hannah grinned. "I know what I want." He ordered the same, mostly to keep things simple, and when the waitress left, silence settled between them. "So what's your story?" she asked, drumming her fingers against the table. Richard hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not to strangers. "Not much to tell. Grew up poor, built a business, made money, got old." Hannah snorted. "Riveting. And you?" She took a sip of the water the waitress had dropped off. "Oh, you know. Grew up bouncing between foster homes. People loved me, until I stopped being the kid they thought I was. Spent a few years learning how to take care of myself. Now I just kind of get by." Richard leaned forward slightly. "And you're okay with that?" Hannah shrugged. "What other choice do I have?" The waitress arrived with their food, setting the plates down with practiced efficiency. Hannah grabbed her burger and took a massive bite, chewing happily. "You eat like you haven't had a real meal in days," Richard observed. "Maybe I haven't," she said, mouth half full, not exactly rolling in options. Richard watched her, something shifting in his chest. He had built his life on logic and numbers, on calculated risks and strategic decisions, but none of that explained why he was sitting here now, watching a teenage girl, one who had no one, who had been cast aside by a society that claimed to value every life, devour a simple meal like it was a luxury. He picked up his burger, but he had already made his decision. Hannah had spent her whole life being left behind. He wasn't going to be another person who walked away. Hannah wiped her hands on the oil-streaked rag, the scent of grease and sweat clinging to her skin. It had been a long shift, but she didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just passing through, scraping by, or waiting for someone to shove her out the door. She had a job, a real one. And as much as she hated to admit it, it felt good. Benny had been tough at first, barking orders, testing her at every turn, but she could tell he wasn't doing it to be cruel. He wanted to see if she would crack, if she was serious about this. And she was. Every bolt she tightened, every engine she checked, every busted alternator she helped replace, it was proof. Proof that she belonged here. She threw the rag over her shoulder and stretched, rolling out the knots in her back. Richard was waiting outside, leaning against his car like he had all the time in the world. You stalking me now? She asked, smirking as she approached. Richard shrugged. Just making sure you didn't burn the place down. Hannah snorted. Not yet. He gestured toward the car. You hungry? She hesitated. She didn't want to admit how much she had been looking forward to this. How, over the past week, these little meals had started to feel like something more than just a rich guy checking in on a charity case. She climbed into the passenger seat. Yeah, all right. They ended up at a small diner, the kind of place where the coffee was always burnt and the food was always good. The waitress barely glanced at them as she refilled cups and jotted down orders with mechanical efficiency. Richard watched as Hannah flipped through the menu, her fingers tapping lightly against the laminated page. How was work? He asked. She shrugged. Benny's tough but fair. Doesn't treat me any different than the other guys, which is nice. Richard took a sip of his coffee. Good. Hannah leaned back in the booth. Still weird, though. Having a routine, having somewhere to be every day, feels like I conned my way into a normal life. Richard smirked. That's called employment. She rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. The waitress came back, setting down 2 plates of food. Hannah dug in immediately, taking a huge bite of her burger. So, Richard said, watching her, what's next? Hannah paused mid-bite. Next? You've got a job now. You've got money coming in. Ever thought about getting your own place? Hannah swallowed, her expression guarded. You really think a landlord's gonna rent to a trans girl with no credit and no cosigner? Richard didn't flinch. If they don't, we'll find one who will. She set her burger down. You say that like it's easy. It's not, he admitted, but it's possible. Hannah looked down at her plate. I don't know, man. Feels like tempting fate. Every time things start going good, something happens. Someone finds out I'm trans, someone gets weird, and suddenly, I'm out on my ass again. Richard studied her, his expression unreadable. That's not going to happen this time. She huffed a laugh. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise you won't be dealing with it alone. She didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever said something like that to her before. No one had ever offered to stand beside her, to fight for her, not in a way that felt real. Richard leaned forward. Look, I know you're used to doing everything on your own, I get it, but you don't have to anymore. Hannah toyed with the edge of her napkin. Why are you doing this? Richard sighed, setting his coffee down. Because you remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. She frowned. Who? He hesitated, then shook his head. A friend. Someone who needed a little help, and no one gave it to them. I couldn't do anything for them back then, but I can do something now. Hannah's throat tightened. She wanted to push back, to remind him that she wasn't some project that she didn't need saving, but the truth was, she was tired. Tired of fighting every battle on her own. She exhaled slowly. All right. We'll see what happens. Richard nodded. That's all I ask. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. When they left the diner, the air outside was crisp, the city lights stretching out around them. Hannah glanced at Richard. You know, you're not as bad as I thought you'd be. He smirked. Don't go getting sentimental on me now. She laughed, shaking her head. Yeah, let's just get out of here before I change my mind. Richard chuckled, unlocking the car. For the first time in a long time, Hannah felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was moving forward. Hannah stood outside the small apartment door, key in hand. It felt heavier than it should have, like she was holding something more than just a piece of metal. This wasn't just any key. It was hers. For the first time in her life, she had a place of her own. No foster homes, no shelters, no couches borrowed for a few nights before someone got tired of her being there. Just a door that led to something that belonged to her. Richard stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching her carefully. You gonna stand there all day? Or are you actually gonna go inside? Hannah let out a breath, steadying herself before unlocking the door. The hinges creaked as it swung open, revealing a tiny living space. Nothing fancy, just a small couch, a coffee table, and a kitchenette with old appliances. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed, but to her it might as well have been a palace. She stepped inside slowly, taking it all in. The air smelled faintly of dust, but it was warm, safe. Hers. "You don't have to decide if you like it right away," Richard said. "You've got time to make it yours." Hannah turned, giving him a look. "Dude, I could be living in a broom closet and it'd still be an upgrade." Richard chuckled. "Fair point." She wandered into the small bedroom, where a mattress sat against the wall. No frame, no headboard, but she didn't care. She ran her fingers along the edge of the window, staring out at the street below. It wasn't much, just a stretch of road with a few shops and a laundromat, but it was stable. It was hers. Richard leaned against the doorway. "Benny says you're doing good at the shop." Hannah smirked. "He told me I wasn't completely useless yesterday. That's basically high praise coming from him." "He wouldn't have kept you this long if you weren't pulling your weight," Richard said. "And now that you've got a steady paycheck, you can start thinking about what's next." Hannah turned to face him. "This is next." She gestured to the room. "This is everything I didn't think I'd get." Richard nodded slowly. "And after this?" She hesitated. She had spent so long thinking only about survival that the idea of a future, one she could actually plan for, felt strange. But for the first time, it wasn't impossible. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I guess I get to figure that out now." Richard smiled, and for a moment, there was nothing else to say. They spent the next hour setting things up. Hannah didn't own much, a backpack with a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, some loose papers she kept more out of habit than necessity, but Richard had shown up earlier with a few bags of basics, sheets, towels, even a lamp. She teased him for it, but deep down, she was grateful. By the time the sun started setting, the place felt less like an empty shell and more like something real. Richard clapped his hands together. "Well, I'd say this calls for a celebration." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "What, you gonna buy me a cake?" Richard smirked. "I was thinking pizza, but now that you mention it, cake's not a bad idea." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "Pizza's fine, old man." They sat on the floor, a pizza box between them, the cheap apartment light flickering slightly overhead. "You know," Richard said, taking a bite of his slice, "I think you'll do just fine here." Hannah chewed thoughtfully. "Yeah, I think so too." She didn't know where life would take her from here. She didn't know what challenges would come next or what obstacles she'd have to face. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of them. For the first time, she had a place in the world, and that was enough. Richard hadn't planned on seeing Hannah again, but the next day he found himself driving through the same streets, his eyes scanning the sidewalks for a familiar figure. He told himself he wasn't looking for her, that he was just taking the scenic route. But he knew that was a lie. Something about the girl had lodged itself in his mind. The way she carried herself, like she'd been forced to grow up too fast, the way she talked about her life, like it was just something she had to survive, the way she barely reacted to cruelty, as if she'd already been worn down by it. He didn't know what he could do for her, if anything, but he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away was the wrong choice. He spotted her sitting on the same curb outside the convenience store, a half-empty soda bottle between her hands. She wasn't eating this time, just staring down at the pavement, lost in thought. He pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window. "You always hang out here?" Hannah glanced up, unimpressed. "You always drive around looking for me?" Richard smirked. "Maybe." She rolled her eyes, but stood up anyway, dusting off her jeans as she stepped toward the car. "What do you want?" He hesitated. He hadn't actually thought this far ahead. "I was going to grab a coffee. Figured you might want something." She raised an eyebrow, studying him like he was some kind of puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. You always feed strays? Or just the trans ones? Richard let out a short laugh. Just the ones who fix my tire for free. She grinned slightly, then shrugged. All right, fine, but I'm getting something sugary. They ended up at a small cafe, the kind of place Richard rarely bothered with. Too young, too loud, too full of people who stared at their phones instead of talking. Hannah, on the other hand, fit right in, sliding into a booth like she belonged there. She ordered a caramel frappuccino with extra whipped cream and a muffin the size of her hand. You know, Richard said as he sipped his black coffee, you didn't ask me what I wanted before you fixed my tire. She smirked. You looked like you needed help. Didn't seem like you were in the mood to chat about your coffee preferences. And you, he asked, you always let strangers buy you food? She shrugged, unwrapping her muffin. Depends on the stranger. Richard tapped his fingers against the table. And what makes me different? Hannah chewed thoughtfully, then swallowed. You don't talk to me like I'm broken. He didn't know how to respond to that. Most people, she continued, swirling her straw around her drink, they either ignore me or they look at me like I'm some tragic story. Poor little trans girl, all alone in the big bad world. She rolled her eyes. It's exhausting. Richard frowned. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. You didn't, she said simply. That's the weird part. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Richard found himself watching her more closely. The way she scanned the room without thinking, as if checking for threats. The way she pulled her sleeves down slightly, hiding the bruises on her wrists. He wondered how many fights she had been in, how many times she had to defend herself just for existing. You ever think about going back to school? He asked. She let out a sharp laugh. For what? More people whispering about me behind my back? More teachers pretending they don't hear it? She shook her head. I've had enough of that. But you're smart. She raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? And how do you know that? You fixed my tire faster than I could have. She smirked. That just means unuseful. It means you know things, Richard corrected, more than you let on. She picked at the edge of her napkin, her expression unreadable. Doesn't mean much when people don't want to see it. Richard exhaled slowly. He had never given much thought to what it meant to be transgender. It had always seemed like someone else's issue, something far removed from his world of business meetings and investments. But now, sitting across from Hannah, he realized how little he understood. You ever think about what you want to do? He asked. Hannah snorted. You mean like a career? Yeah. She took a sip of her drink, considering. I don't know. When I was younger, I thought about being a mechanic. Seemed like a good way to stay under the radar. No one cares who you are if you can fix their car. But you didn't. She shook her head. Turns out people do care. Had a guy tell me to my face that he didn't want someone like me working on his truck. She shrugged. Got tired of fighting for a spot no one wanted me in. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent his life surrounded by men like that, men who thought the world belonged to them, who decided who got to succeed and who didn't. What if you didn't have to fight for it? He asked. She gave him a skeptical look. What's that supposed to mean? He wasn't sure yet. He just knew that walking away from her now, after hearing all of this, felt wrong. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in fate, but he did believe in opportunity. I've got some people I know, he said carefully. Business owners, mechanics. If you wanted, I could make a call. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. You trying to be my fairy godmother or something? Richard chuckled. I wouldn't look good in a dress. Hannah smirked, but didn't say anything. She just stirred her drink, her gaze distant. Richard leaned forward slightly. Look, I'm not trying to fix your life. I don't know, I think you deserve better than what you've got. She met his eyes, and for the first time there was something unguarded in her expression. Vulnerability, maybe, or maybe just exhaustion. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I'd like to." Hannah let out a slow breath. "I don't trust people easily." "I figured." She studied him for a long moment. Then finally she shrugged. "All right, old man. Let's see what you got." Richard smiled. He didn't know where this was going, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. Richard wasn't used to waiting on people. His life had always been defined by efficiency, meetings, appointments, schedules that never allowed for wasted time. And yet here he was, parked outside a run-down laundromat, checking his watch, wondering if Hannah was going to show up. He had called in a favor, spoken to an old friend who owned a mechanic shop on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't know if Hannah would take it. He didn't even know if she'd show. She did. She rounded the corner, hands shoved into the pockets of an oversized hoodie, her backpack slung over one shoulder. When she spotted his car, she hesitated for only a second before walking up and leaning against the passenger door. "You know," she said, tapping her fingers against the window, "I could have just ignored you." Richard smirked, unlocking the door. "But you didn't." She slid into the seat, pulling the door shut behind her. "Guess I was curious." Richard pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic. "Curious about what?" She shrugged. "Whether you were serious. About helping. You think I was lying?" She tilted her head, studying him. "No. I think you're a rich old man who got caught up in a moment. Maybe you felt guilty. Maybe you just wanted to do something nice for a sad little trans girl." Richard's grip on the wheel tightened. "That what you think this is?" She exhaled through her nose, turning to stare out the window. "I don't know. People don't usually help people like me." The way she said it, flat, matter of fact, made Richard's chest ache. "Well," he said, "maybe they should." She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city passing by in a blur of neon signs and worn-out buildings. Richard glanced at her every so often, noting the way she chewed the inside of her cheek, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her knee. She was nervous. He couldn't blame her. When they pulled up to the garage, she let out a low whistle. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small shop tucked between an auto parts store and a pawn shop. But it was clean, well-maintained, the kind of place that had been around for years. "You sure this guy knows what he's doing?" she asked, eyeing the place. Richard smirked. "He ran my shop back when I was still working." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "You owned a mechanic shop?" "One of my first businesses," Richard said, stepping out of the car. "Come on." She followed him inside, keeping close but not too close. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, the sound of a wrench clanking against an engine echoing from the back. A man in his 60s, his gray hair tied back in a short ponytail, looked up from where he was working under a lifted car. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Richard Lawson, walking into my shop like he still owns the place." Richard chuckled. "Good to see you too, Benny." Benny's gaze flickered to Hannah. He took her in quickly, the oversized hoodie, the guarded expression, the way she looked like she was ready to bolt at any second. He didn't react, just nodded. "This the kid you told me about?" Hannah bristled. "I'm not a kid." Benny smirked. "You any good with cars?" Hannah crossed her arms. "Better than most." Benny glanced at Richard, then back at her. "You got experience." "My uncle let me help out at his shop before people started giving him grief about me being there," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "After that, I just watched, learned what I could." Benny studied her for a moment, then jerked his head toward the car he'd been working on. "Show me." Hannah hesitated. Richard touched her shoulder lightly. "Go on." She exhaled, then stepped forward. Benny handed her a wrench, pointing to the open hood. "Engine's overheating. What's the first thing you check?" Hannah didn't even pause. "Coolant levels." If that's fine, check the thermostat. Benny nodded, watching as she moved with careful precision. She checked the coolant, then reached for the thermostat, testing it. Looks like it's sticking, she muttered. Could be a bad sensor too. Benny grinned. Not bad. Hannah straightened. Told you. Benny chuckled, tossing the rag over his shoulder. You want the job? Hannah blinked. Just like that? You know what you're doing, Benny said simply. And I don't have time for idiots. She looked at Richard, like she was waiting for him to say something, to confirm that this wasn't some kind of trick. He just smiled. It's yours if you want it, Benny said. Hannah swallowed, then nodded. Yeah, I want it. Benny clapped her on the back. Good, you start tomorrow. Richard watched as she processed it, as something in her expression shifted from suspicion to something dangerously close to hope. When they left the shop, Hannah was quieter than usual. She stared out the window as Richard drove, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. You all right? He asked. She let out a shaky breath. Yeah. I don't know. I wasn't expecting that. You doubted me. She smirked slightly. A little. Richard chuckled. Fair enough. She was silent for a few more moments before she spoke again, her voice softer this time. No one's ever done something like this for me before. Richard glanced at her. Then maybe it's time someone did. Hannah swallowed hard, then nodded. Yeah, maybe. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked like she actually believed it.